27 letters she refused to burn until he came home. The typewriter keys clicked with mechanical precision in the quiet newsroom of the Portland Tribune, each strike echoing through the cavernous space like raindrops on a tin roof. Margaret Maggie Sullivan pressed her fingers against the keys with practiced determination, her auburn hair falling in gentle waves around her face as she leaned forward, absorbed in her work. The clock on the wall read 11:30, and most of her colleagues had long since departed for their evening routines, leaving behind only the lingering scent of cigarette smoke and the faint aroma of coffee that had grown bitter hours ago. Your support means the world to us. Hit the subscribe button and join our community of romance lovers. It was March 15th, 1943, and Maggie was crafting her weekly column on rationing recipes. Hardly the hard-hitting journalism she'd dreamed of when she'd fought tooth and nail for her position at the Tribune 2 years earlier. But in wartime America, even food writers served their country, helping housewives stretch their sugar rations and make meatloaf from mysterious combinations of vegetables and hope. The sound of footsteps echoed across the polished linoleum, drawing her attention from the half-finished article about making coffee from chicory root. She looked up to see Eddie Morrison, the night editor, approaching with an envelope in his weathered hands. His face bore the expression of a man carrying news that would change everything. "This came for you about an hour ago," Eddie said, his voice softer than usual. "Thought you might want it right away." Maggie's heart performed a peculiar dance in her chest as she recognized the handwriting on the envelope, bold, confident strokes that belonged to Lieutenant Tommy Chen of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. She and Tommy had been corresponding for 8 months now, ever since her editor had assigned her to write letters to servicemen as part of the paper's morale-boosting initiative. What had begun as a professional obligation had blossomed into something neither of them had expected. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the envelope, carefully preserving the delicate paper that had traveled thousands of miles from somewhere in Italy. Tommy's letters had become the highlight of her weeks, arriving irregularly, but always carrying the warmth of his personality and the subtle humor that helped her forget, if only temporarily, the weight of the world pressing down on everyone's shoulders. "My dearest Maggie, I hope this letter finds you well and still fighting the good fight against bland wartime cuisine. I've been thinking about your last letter, the one where you described the cherry blossoms blooming along the Willamette River. Here in the mountains of Italy, spring feels like a distant promise, but your words painted such a vivid picture that I could almost smell the flowers and feel the soft Portland rain on my face. I have something important to tell you, something I've been wrestling with for weeks now. The Army has granted me a 2-week leave, and I'll be arriving in Portland on May 3rd. 8 months of letters, Maggie, and we've never seen each other's faces, except in the small photographs we've exchanged. I've memorized every detail of that picture you sent, the way you're laughing in front of the Tribune building, your hair catching the sunlight, that determined glint in your eyes that tells me you're someone who doesn't back down from a challenge. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night, staring at the stars through whatever makeshift shelter we've constructed. I'm Japanese-American, Maggie. 2nd generation, born in San Francisco, as American as apple pie and baseball, but still Japanese enough that my own country questions my loyalty. I've never mentioned this in my letters, because I wanted you to know me, the real me, before you knew the me that other people see first. My family spent the first year of the war in Manzanar. While I was volunteering for the most dangerous missions Europe had to offer, my parents and my younger sister were living behind barbed wire in the California desert, guilty of nothing except having the wrong ancestry at the wrong time in history. They've since been relocated to a camp in Arkansas, and I send most of my pay to help them purchase the small comforts that make their situation bearable. I understand if this changes things between us. I understand if the woman who writes so eloquently about hope and perseverance decides that associating with someone like me isn't worth the potential complications. But I had to tell you before I arrive in Portland, before I knock on your door with flowers and nervous laughter, because honesty has been the foundation of everything we've built together through these letters. If you're still willing to meet me, I'll be staying at the Benson Hotel. If not, please just don't write back, and I'll understand that some distances are too great to bridge, even with the strongest of intentions. Yours, always and regardless. Tommy. Maggie read the letter 3 times before setting it down on her desk, with hands that had grown steadier with each reading. Around her, the newsroom hummed with the quiet sounds of a building settling into night, the distant rumble of the printing presses in the basement, the whistle of wind through the tall windows, the soft tick of the clock marking time that suddenly felt precious and fleeting. She thought about Tommy's previous letters, searching her memories for clues she might have missed. He'd written about his squad with deep affection, about the Italian countryside with an artist's eye for detail, about missing his mother's cooking with a longing that spoke of strong family bonds. He'd sent her recipes for dishes she'd never heard of, described festivals and traditions that painted pictures of a rich cultural heritage. She'd assumed he was simply more worldly than the other soldiers who wrote to her, more observant, more poetic in his descriptions of foreign places. Now she understood that his observations came from a different perspective entirely, that of someone who'd always lived between worlds, who understood what it meant to be viewed with suspicion by the very country he was risking his life to defend. Eddie had retreated to his desk, but she could feel his occasional glances, the weight of his concern. Everyone at the Tribune knew about her correspondence with soldiers. It had become something of a running joke, the way she'd light up when mail arrived, the way she'd retreat to quiet corners to read letters from young men fighting on distant shores. "Everything all right, Maggie?" Eddie called softly across the newsroom. "Yes," she replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Everything's going to be just fine." That night, Maggie walked home through the quiet streets of Portland, her mind churning with thoughts and possibilities. The city wore its wartime face, darkened windows, empty streets after curfew, the constant underlying tension of a population living on edge. But spring was asserting itself despite the war, with daffodils pushing through the soil in Victory Gardens and the faint scent of cherry blossoms carried on the evening breeze. In her small apartment above Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Maggie sat at her kitchen table with a cup of weak tea and a sheet of her best stationery. The words came slowly at first, then with increasing confidence and clarity. "Dear Tommy, your letter arrived tonight like an unexpected gift, and I've read it so many times that I could probably recite it from memory. I keep thinking about the courage it must have taken to write those words, to risk everything we've built together for the sake of honesty. You're right that we've never seen each other's faces, but you're wrong about one thing. I've known the real you for months now. I've known you through the kindness in your letters to a lonely fellow soldier who missed his family, through the way you describe sunsets over Italian vineyards, through your gentle teasing about my attempts to make meatloaf from sawdust and good intentions. I've known you through your courage, your humor, your homesickness, and in your questions about life in America that made me see my own country through fresh eyes. What you've told me doesn't change any of that. If anything, it makes me admire you more. I think about what you've endured, watching your family imprisoned while you fought for the country that put them there. And I'm amazed by your strength, by your ability to continue believing in ideals that haven't always been extended to you. I'll be at Union Station on May 3rd, wearing a blue dress and probably holding a newspaper so you'll recognize me. I'll be the woman who's been counting the days until she can finally thank you in person for showing her what real courage looks like. I have something to confess as well. I've kept every letter you've ever written to me, all 127 of them, tied with a ribbon and stored in a box beside my bed. My mother keeps telling me I should burn them, that it's not proper for an unmarried woman to be so attached to correspondence with a stranger. But they're not just letters to me, Tommy. They're proof that love can grow in the most unlikely soil, that two hearts can find each other across impossible distances. I'll see you in 18 days. But who's counting? With all my love, Maggie. The weeks that followed passed with agonizing slowness. Maggie threw herself into her work with renewed energy, writing pieces about the Japanese-American soldiers of the 492nd Regiment that her editor initially rejected as too controversial. She researched and rewrote, softening the political edges while preserving the human stories, until she'd crafted articles that even the most conservative readers couldn't dismiss as unpatriotic propaganda. She learned about the Heart Mountain and Minidoka camps, about families separated and lives disrupted, about young men who'd volunteered to fight from behind barbed wire to prove their loyalty to a country that had branded them as enemies. She wrote about mothers sending care packages to sons fighting in Europe while living in barracks with walls so thin they could hear their neighbors' conversations, about the heartbreak of fighting for freedom while their own families lived as prisoners. On April 28th, 5 days before Tommy's scheduled arrival, Maggie received a telegram that made her knees buckle with relief and terror in equal measure. Wounded, stop, minor injuries, stop, still coming home, stop, love, Tommy. She spent the remaining days in a state of nervous anticipation, changing her outfit 3 times on the morning of May 3rd, before settling on the blue dress she'd promised to wear. A simple but elegant creation she'd purchased with her savings and tailored to fit perfectly. She arrived at Union Station an hour early, positioning herself near the information board where she could see the trains arriving from California. The station bustled with the constant movement of wartime America, soldiers on leave embracing sweethearts, families saying tearful goodbyes, the ever-present undercurrent of uncertainty that colored every public gathering. Maggie clutched her copy of the Tribune and tried to calm her racing heart as train after train arrived and departed. At 3:47 p.m. she saw him. Tommy Chen stepped off the train from San Francisco with a slight limp and a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his army dress uniform pressed despite the long journey. He was shorter than she'd imagined, with gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a smile that transformed his entire face when he spotted her across the crowded platform. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, 8 months of letters and dreams and hopes crystallizing into the reality of 2 people meeting for the first time. Then Tommy was walking toward her, his limp more pronounced than he'd probably wanted her to notice, and Maggie was moving to meet him halfway. "You're even more beautiful than your photograph," Tommy said, when they were close enough to speak without shouting over the station noise. "You're limping," Maggie replied, then immediately felt foolish for stating the obvious. Tommy laughed, the same warm chuckle she'd imagined while reading his more humorous letters. "Just a little souvenir from the Italian countryside. Nothing that won't heal." They stood there for another moment, suddenly awkward despite the intimacy of their correspondence. The transition from words on paper to flesh and blood presence was more jarring than either had anticipated. "I made reservations at Huber's," Maggie said finally. "I thought you might like to try our famous turkey dinner, unless you'd prefer something else. I don't know what you like to eat, actually. I mean, I know from your letters, but that's different from—" "Maggie," Tommy interrupted gently, reaching out to touch her arm. The contact sent a small shock through both of them. "Huber's sounds perfect. I've been dreaming about real American food for months." Over dinner in the dimly lit restaurant, they began the delicate process of translating their written relationship into spoken words. Tommy told her about the shrapnel wound in his leg that had earned him his stateside leave, about the friends he'd lost in the mountains of Italy, about the strange experience of fighting for a country that had imprisoned his family. Maggie shared her struggles at the Tribune, her battles to be taken seriously as more than just a society reporter, her growing understanding of the complexities of American identity that his letters had inspired. She told him about the box of letters beside her bed, about her mother's disapproval, about the way his words had become essential to her daily routine. "I used to wonder if you were real," Tommy admitted over coffee and pie. "Your letters were so perfect, full of exactly what I needed to hear, exactly when I needed to hear it. I thought maybe you were too good to be true." "I wondered the same thing," Maggie confessed. "Sometimes I'd sit at my typewriter and think about how strange it was that I was falling in love with someone I'd never met, someone who might be completely different from the person I'd imagined." The word love hung between them for a moment, acknowledged but not yet fully explored. Tommy's 2 weeks in Portland passed like a dream, punctuated by the harsh realities of wartime restrictions and social expectations. They walked through Laurelhurst Park, attended movies at the Hollywood Theater, spent long afternoons talking in the lobby of the Benson Hotel under the watchful eyes of other guests, who clearly disapproved of the young white woman spending so much time with the Asian soldier. The stares and whispered comments followed them everywhere, but Maggie faced them with the same determination she brought to her journalism, her chin raised and her hand firmly linked with Tommy's arm. She introduced him to her colleagues at the Tribune, where he charmed them with stories from the front lines and insights into the Italian campaign that made even the most seasoned war correspondents take notes. On their 8th day together, they received news that changed everything. Tommy's leave had been extended by another week due to complications with his leg wound. But more importantly, his unit was being reassigned to the Pacific Theater upon his return. The 402nd was being sent to France for one final push, but Tommy's injury meant he'd likely be transferred to a different unit, possibly stationed in the Philippines or Japan itself, if the invasion proceeded as planned. "That could be years," Maggie said that evening as they sat on a bench overlooking the Willamette River. "Years before you come home again." "I know," Tommy replied, his voice heavy with the weight of possibilities neither wanted to consider. They spent the remaining days of his leave creating memories with desperate intensity, as if they could store up enough happiness to sustain them through whatever separation lay ahead. Tommy met Maggie's parents, enduring her father's suspicious questions and her mother's polite but frosty reception with grace and dignity. Maggie, in turn, learned more about Tommy's family, about traditions and foods and celebrations that painted a picture of the life he'd lost when the war began. On their last night together, they returned to Huber's, sitting in the same booth where they'd shared their first meal. The restaurant was quieter than usual, filled with other couples stealing precious moments before separations that might last months or years, or forever. "I have something for you," Tommy said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box, carved with intricate designs. "My grandfather made this before he died. It's for important things, valuable things that need to be kept safe." Maggie opened the box to find it lined with silk, empty and waiting. "It's beautiful, Tommy, but what am I supposed to keep in it?" "Letters," he said simply, "the ones I'm going to write to you from wherever they send me. And maybe someday, something else." He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small velvet jewelry box, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it to reveal a simple gold ring with a small diamond that caught the restaurant's dim lighting. "Maggie Sullivan," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know this is crazy. I know we've only known each other in person for 2 weeks, and I know the world might not be ready for what we represent, but I also know that I love you, and I know that these letters we've shared have shown me the kind of partnership I want for the rest of my life. Will you marry me?" The restaurant seemed to fade away as Maggie looked at the ring, at Tommy's hopeful and terrified expression, at the future stretching out before them, filled with uncertainty and possibility in equal measure. "Yes," she said, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "Yes, Tommy Chen, I'll marry you." They married the next morning in a simple ceremony at City Hall, with Eddie Morrison and Maggie's friend Sarah from the Tribune serving as witnesses. Maggie wore a simple white dress she'd purchased the day before, and Tommy wore his dress uniform, his medals catching the morning light streaming through the windows. The ceremony was brief and official, but as they exchanged vows and rings, both felt the weight of history settling around them. They were declaring their love in a world torn apart by hatred, choosing hope in the face of overwhelming uncertainty, building something beautiful in the midst of destruction. That afternoon, Tommy left for California, where he would rejoin his unit before shipping out to an unknown destination in the Pacific. Maggie stood on the platform at Union Station, wearing her new wedding ring and trying to memorize every detail of her husband's face as the train pulled away. The letters that followed were different now, marked by the intimacy of marriage and the desperate longing of separation. Tommy wrote from Camp Shelby in Mississippi, then from a transport ship somewhere in the Pacific, finally from a censored location that Maggie guessed was the Philippines, based on his descriptions of tropical heat and monsoon rains. Maggie's letters chronicled her new life as a war bride, the challenges of explaining her marriage to friends and family, the satisfaction of her evolving career at the Tribune. She'd been promoted to cover local politics, partly due to the quality of her articles about Japanese-American soldiers, and partly because the war had created opportunities for women that wouldn't have existed in peacetime. For 18 months, their marriage existed primarily on paper, sustained by letters that crossed oceans and continents, carrying love and hope across impossible distances. Maggie kept every letter in Tommy's grandfather's wooden box, watching it fill with evidence of their enduring connection. Then, in November 1944, the letters stopped. Maggie waited for 2 weeks before contacting the War Department, only to be told that information about Tommy's unit was classified, and that she should await further notification through proper channels. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still no word came. By Christmas 1944, Maggie had convinced herself that Tommy was dead. The Pacific Theater was claiming thousands of American lives, and Japanese-American soldiers, despite their documented heroism, were often assigned to the most dangerous missions. She continued writing letters anyway, addressing them to her husband's last known location, and mailing them into a void that seemed to swallow them without response. "You should move on, dear," her mother said gently one evening in January 1945. "It's been 3 months. If he were alive, he would have found a way to write." But Maggie couldn't bring herself to stop writing, couldn't bring herself to remove her wedding ring, couldn't bring herself to burn the 189 letters that now filled Tommy's grandfather's box. Something deep in her heart insisted that her husband was still alive, that their love was strong enough to survive whatever horrors he was facing. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, and still no word came. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, and Japan surrendered, bringing the global conflict to an end. Maggie threw herself into covering the city's celebration, interviewing returning veterans and writing about the challenges of transitioning from wartime to peacetime economy. But privately, she remained in limbo, neither wife nor widow, sustained only by her faith in love that had grown from words on paper and flowered during 2 perfect weeks in Portland. It was October 15th, 1945, 13 months after Tommy's last letter, when Maggie heard the knock on her apartment door. She'd been working late, editing an article about housing shortages for returning veterans, when the soft but persistent knocking interrupted her concentration. She opened the door expecting to find Mrs. Henderson with a complaint about the noise from her typewriter, but instead found herself face to face with a stranger, a thin, sunburned man with familiar eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Hello, Maggie," Tommy said, his voice hoarse with emotion and exhaustion. "I'm sorry I'm late." For a moment she simply stared at him, afraid that grief and hope had finally driven her to hallucinations. But then Tommy was stepping forward, reaching out to touch her face with trembling fingers, and she knew with absolute certainty that her husband had come home. "The letters stopped," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I was captured," Tommy explained, pulling her into his arms. "Spent 14 months in a Japanese prison camp. They didn't allow communication with home, and after the surrender, it took weeks to process all the prisoners, to get transport arranged. I've been trying to get home to you since August." They held each other in the doorway, 2 people rebuilding their connection after an eternity of separation, rediscovering the physical reality of love that had survived on nothing but faith and written words. "I kept writing to you," Maggie said against his shoulder, "even after the letters stopped coming. I couldn't stop believing you were alive." "I know," Tommy murmured. "I could feel it somehow, even in the darkest moments. I could feel you loving me, waiting for me. It's what kept me alive." That night they sat together at Maggie's kitchen table, surrounded by the evidence of their enduring love. Tommy had brought home letters he'd written to her during his captivity, dozens of them that had never been sent, written on scraps of paper and hidden from his captors. Maggie showed him the wooden box, now overflowing with correspondence that had sustained her through the darkest period of her life. 227 letters, Maggie said, running her fingers over the familiar envelopes. "I counted them yesterday. 227 letters that I refused to burn, even when everyone told me I should move on." Tommy picked up one of his unsent letters, written on a piece of bamboo bark. "I wrote to you every day I could find paper or something to write on. I told you about the other prisoners, about the ways we kept each other's spirits up, about my dreams of coming home to Portland and picking up where we left off." They spent the next several hours reading aloud to each other, Tommy's unsent letters revealing the daily struggles and small victories of prison camp life, Maggie's letters chronicling her growth as a journalist and her unwavering faith in their love. As dawn broke over Portland, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Tommy and Maggie Chen began the process of rebuilding their life together. The war had changed them both, had tested their love in ways they never could have imagined, but it had also proven that some connections are strong enough to survive anything. "What do we do with all these letters?" Maggie asked, looking at the scattered correspondence that covered their kitchen table. Tommy smiled, the same warm expression that had captivated her at Union Station 2.5 years earlier. "We keep them," he said simply. "They're our history, our proof that love can grow in the most impossible circumstances. Someday maybe our children will read them and understand what we went through to be together." "Our children?" Maggie asked, raising an eyebrow. "If you're willing," Tommy replied, suddenly shy. "I know we have a lot to figure out, a lot of healing to do, but I spent 14 months dreaming about the family we might build together, about the life we could create in a world finally at peace." Maggie reached across the table to take his hand, marveling at the reality of his presence after so many months of existing on hope alone. "I'm willing," she said. "I'm willing to build whatever kind of life we can imagine together." Outside their window, Portland was waking up to the first full day of their reunion, a city transformed by war, but still capable of sheltering love that had proven itself stronger than distance, stronger than prejudice, stronger than time itself. The 227 letters would remain in Tommy's grandfather's wooden box for the rest of their lives, a testament to the power of words to sustain the human heart through the darkest of times. And in the years that followed, as Tommy and Maggie built their life together, raising 3 children, building careers, facing the challenges and joys of a marriage that had begun in the most unlikely circumstances, they would sometimes take out those letters and read them aloud to each other, remembering the people they had been when love was new and the future was uncertain. But that morning in October 1945, as the sun rose over Portland and 2 hearts that had found each other across impossible distances settled into the quiet joy of reunion, the future stretched ahead of them like an unwritten letter, full of possibilities and promise and the enduring power of love to triumph over anything the world might offer in opposition. The war was over. The letters had served their purpose, and Tommy and Maggie Chen were finally, truly, together.